This is Inner Healing Paths podcast. Here we discuss the healing of the mind, body, soul, and spirit through a variety of different paths. We have emotional and spiritually minded conversations centering on ancestral healing, psychology, astrology, yoga, meditation, magic, and indigenous spiritual practices of the world. I am your host, Swiecicki, and I am so happy you are here. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I am your host, Rosa, and I'm so excited to share this interview with you all. I had the opportunity to sit with writer Atava Garcia, Swiecicki. She wrote a book titled The Curanderismo Toolkit. And in our conversation, we talk about plant medicine, we talk about rituals and healing. Atava shares her journey of discovering or finding curanderismo, finding herbalism, and we talk about the powerful benefits of limpias and curanderismo, how it helps folks heal not just from physical but emotional and spiritual wounds. And she shares so much wisdom and so much knowledge about this, and I'm so appreciative of her willingness to come and talk and share with you all. If you find this episode healing and nourishing on your journey, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, share with a friend, and if you feel called to, leave me a review so more people can know about this podcast. This episode does not treat or diagnose any physical or mental health condition. This does not replace any kind of physical or mental health services of any kind. Guests have a right to share their opinion and perspective, and this does not constitute an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Atava Garcia. Take a listen. Hi, Atava. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for agreeing to come on and being interviewed by me.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation, Rosa.
Yeah, of course. And to get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and the healing work that you do?
Definitely. Yeah. Right now I'm living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Tewa Pueblo territory. But I consider myself a very recent transplant. I moved here in the pandemic, spent most of my life in the Oakland, California Bay Area. Huchin is the name of the indigenous territory, Ohlone territory. My family moved to California when I was 13, but my roots are actually in the Midwest. I was born in Detroit, and a lot of my family is from there. And in terms of family history and story, like a lot of my grandparents were immigrants from somewhere else who all ended up from Mexico, Hungary, and Poland, who ended up in Detroit in the early 1900s when everything was booming in the auto industry. So so my ancestral background is I have ancestors on my mother's side from Mexico, from Guanajuato, actually from New Mexico, where I'm living now, kind of close to where, according to family story, I have ancestors from northern New Mexico who then traveled to Mexico because there was not this border. And also my mother has family also from Hungary, and my father's family is from Poland. So I consider myself on the Turtle Island in Eastern Europe. Both lineages are all inform my work. And in terms of my work as a healer, I really got called onto the herbal path as a young adult. I'm now 54, and it was in my early 20s. So over 30 years ago, I went to an herbal gathering, fell in love with herbalism, and just felt like I was coming home. That wasn't an option in high school or college to study herbal medicine. I'm happy to say, I know that's changing now in a lot of places, and then through herbalism, as I studied, I became very interested in, or had a lot of curiosity, I would say, about the ancestral traditions or the medicine herbal traditions of my own ancestors. And so through that, I was fortunate to meet Doña Enriqueta Contreras, who's a curandera from Oaxaca. So then began my path of studying curanderismo. You know, it was a couple of years after already on the herbal path. So I really feel like as the work I do with, you know, with my clients, with students, is really centered on herbal medicine, on plant medicine, but very much informed by all that I've learned from my maestras, and also just this remembering of ancestral medicine, I would say in a broader context, that plants are our relatives, they are ancestors, they are, you know, beings with intelligence. And so really trying to come from that perspective when working with plants. You know, I love the science, I love all of that, but also I feel like so much of it is about developing relationships. So yeah, when I work with clients, I say I'm just like a matchmaker. I just, you know, I try to introduce people to plant herbal allies that they that can benefit them, and then they have that relationship with the plant, and then they can build on that and work with that, you know, so they don't need me to continually introduce the plant. So I do that a lot through work with clients, but also as a teacher. And I would say a lot of my work has been teaching, because, you know, it's that whole thing, you can give someone a fish or you can teach them how to fish. Like I really believe that with herbalism. Like I think there's a lot of pretty accessible skills and knowledge, even just starting in our kitchen, right? In our spices and the vegetables, which are many also medicinal, and just learning how to empower ourselves to take care of our health, which is also the way it's always been for millennia for most people in most cultures. So I think this separation from herbalism or food medicine is fairly recent, depending on the people and their background. But anyways, that was a long introduction.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you for sharing about where you come from and your lineage. I think it, you know, is so important to acknowledge the parts where we come from, right? And our ancestors and the lands where we are from. So thank you for that introduction. And I'm wondering, you know, I think for a lot of healers, and you know, I'm a mental health therapist, and just in general, I think folks that go into a field where we're helping others, a lot of times it stems from our own search for medicine, for the medicina that we need. And I'm wondering, you know, just in your own life and experience, and how did that almost prepare you, you know, or how did that lead to your career, or your, I should say, as a curandera? How did that in a way prepare you for where you're at now?
Yeah, well, I believe, and this is from my examination of my own life, but also working with so many students. I believe the way we learn our path as healers is really by working with our own, whether it's a physical health issue, an emotional issue, a trauma. I know you do a lot of work with trauma, and ancestral family. Like we really get initiated and trained by working on ourselves and through our own stuff. All right, what I read about in the book, one of my teachers, Estela Roman, calls that with los aires, like our anger, our susto, our, you know, our fear, our shock. So I think since a lot of us, well, I'll say for myself, I didn't grow up in a family where I was like, some elder noticed me and said, oh, she's intuitive, she's sensitive, train her.
Right,
And it
yeah.
was through life's trials and tribulations. I mean, myself growing up in a family, you know, with a lot of mental health issues, with addiction, with all this stuff, that, you know, I feel like I didn't realize it at the time, that I was drawn to medicina to heal myself. And I was also at the same point trying to help others, like as many of us are. But I think the more I've walked down this path, the more I definitely have to prioritize taking care of myself, knowing when it's time to just focus on me and not be giving so much to others. And because there's always something, right? Like I feel like when I was younger, there was a lot of emotional work I was doing, and then when I got older, then a lot of physical health issues, and then and we're also in a really challenging time. So yeah, I think what I love about curanderismo and herbalism, which are under the same umbrella, is that when I'm going through a hard time, I have tools, which is why I call my book the toolkit. There's things I can work with to help my own self. I also deeply believe in therapy, and I'm so glad for your work and the growing number of BIPOC or therapists and trauma-informed therapists. Like that is such important work. So I believe in working on a lot of different levels, but that level of working with self, like say it's giving myself a self limpia. I went through a challenging relationship with a friend and just feel really upset. And it's noticing like, okay, I'm in this state, I'm kind of spinning out, but I'll take this time to give myself a limpia, to rub the wave over my body, to use the hierbas, to just cry, to release, and then just noticing, okay, I feel better. Like feels like a weight was lifted. I can go on with my day. And and sometimes we need multiple of those or multiple treatments, self-treatment and then receiving from others. But yeah, I really believe, I think people call it like the wounded healer. Like I don't know anyone. If anyone is like on the healer path and they say they don't have any stuff, then I would be actually suspicious, because, and I think
absolutely. Me too.
Yeah, because I think I've noticed this tendency, and for us, maybe it's a westernized American thing, but we see our healers, we want to elevate them, we want to put them on a pedestal, and sometimes they want to be elevated and be like, oh, I know it all, I have everything together. But I feel like that's very, very dangerous, because for many reasons. So I like to stay very humble and say, I'm working along with everybody else. I have training and skills, so I like to share those with others and support people when I'm in the right space to do it. But first and foremost, it's always about knowing myself, tending to myself, but with all of these beautiful practices, and then the benefit is we learn, and then we actually can apply that. Those of us who work with other people can apply that to our clients. You probably notice this. If I'm going through something, whatever, like say it's a physical thing, like working with digestion, and I'll get really good at treating myself, and then suddenly I'm getting all these clients with the same.
Oh my goodness. It happens all the time. All the time. It's been like, for me, just throughout my career, it has always been that. And it's fascinating. But yes, absolutely. I feel that, a lot of the work that we do, even in as a therapist, and definitely the work that you do, it is also very much, it's soul work, right? We're working with a human being and their energy and their soul and spirit. And for that reason, I feel that it's part of what, when we go through difficulties, when we work through it, and when we process our own difficulties, then we're able to integrate that, and then through that process really understand someone's journey in a deeper, more soulful way. Because yes, we can learn it in school, and we can go and read about it, and we have this book knowledge, which is also very important. But then there is it changes you as a healer, as a therapist, when you're able to embody that also in your own lived experience. I'm talking about the healing, right? When you embody the healing of your own wounds, it translates into the work with others in a much deeper way. I feel that. I don't know.
I agree.
Yeah, no. And so let's go back a little bit. You mentioned a couple of words and you mentioned your book. So I want to talk about your book. It's called the Curanderex, right?
Yeah.
Curanderex, sorry, Curanderex Toolkit. And I just want to say that when I first held your book and I browsed through it, at first glance, I felt so much, I want to say peace and like this beautiful energy just holding your book and browsing through it is is the pictures are beautiful, the way the colors, everything is just organized, which I appreciate. It's organized in such a beautiful way, and the blending of history and story and tradition, it was just beautiful. So I want to say that because I feel that I come across a lot of books about energy healing and curanderismo, but your book stood out to me because it's just so beautiful, and the way it's presented and organized was just it really resonated with me in my brain, and the way I learned it was just lovely, and so thank you for putting that work out for all of us.
Thank you. Yes, and a shout out to the book designer. His name is Ashley, who really had a vision to make it a beautiful book. And actually, my publisher, Heyday, like a lot of their books are very visually rich. And when I was originally writing the book, I actually did not. I did not even know that it would end up being so gorgeous and so full of illustrations, which honestly that's part of the medicina, right? Like it's some of us, like you said, some people are visual learners, like to see the pictures of the plants, to have the faces of the different curanderecs I spotlight, just it brings it not just text. And also just trying to, for me, what I did envision was trying to represent this tradition, which has so much beauty. Like so many of our practices have flowers, have aroma, have taste, have sound. So trying to represent that in a book, I'm really, really grateful that it turned out. And thank you for that you
No, of course. Of course. And so tell us a little bit about what is curanderismo, from your perspective, from your lived experience. How do you see curanderismo? How can you define it for us?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it really translates just to like the art of healing, and relates to, and actually when I was doing my research, I think I actually found the person who termed curanderismo, which is Dr. Teo Torres, who's works here at University of New Mexico, and organizes a 2-week curanderismo class every summer, which has been going on for over 20 years. So when I talked to him, he so what I learned from my teachers in Mexico is like people don't necessarily use, although I think the term curanderismo maybe is becoming more used there, but it was just like go see this senora who gives a limpia, or go see this elder who will give you herbs. Like it was just a person in the community. And then obviously the curar is to cure, curandero is someone who cures. So curanderismo is just the art and practice of traditional medicine, which of Mexico, but also in terms of that lineage, also throughout the quote US Southwest, because of the borders that didn't really exist. But then there's also throughout all Latinx communities, in countries and in diaspora, there's also different versions of curanderismo. So, and in and of itself, it's a traditional medicine, it's an ancestral medicine, but it, in terms of what comes from Mexico, is already a synthesis of the indigenous practices of the many different communities that were and still are present in the continent, as well as the influence from people who were from Africa, many as enslaved people, but then there's also theories that there was a lot of African presence in the continent, in the Americas before Columbus. And then there's also the traditions that came from Europe. So it really became what Elena Avila, who wrote Woman Who Glows in the Dark, who's a curandera and now an ancestor, she called it the three-headed serpent. So really these three cultures, those indigenous to Mexico, those from primarily West Africa and from Spain and other parts of Europe, coming together and forming a system of medicine. So as it's gone through the years, I mean, I really see it changing too. And in modernity, it's those of us, I think, who are embracing, ancestral medicine practices, which have roots in Mexico or Latin America. And it's always adapting to the times and to the community. So the way I came of age in, Northern California in this certain community, the way it was practiced, the way we worked, may be different than someone who's in a small, village in rural Mexico, right? It's going to look different, but the similarities are some of the foundational practices, like the limpia, which is a way to kind of spiritually, energetically cleanse and bless ourselves. It can be a very cathartic experience, or it can be gentle. Practices of baños or baths. I mean, what I learned as an herbalist is I felt like, for me, curanderismo brought back some of the parts of herbalism that I felt like were missing in like kind of standard American education, because it was working, like we said, with the soul or the spirit, and also using herbs in a real sensual way, again, like rubbing them on your body or bathing in them and their aroma. So and then I think what's common too in many places are some of our diagnoses, like susto, which would be translated loosely to like a shock or a trauma. We can have little sustos or big sustos or chronic sustos, which similar to post-traumatic stress. So that's all to say, curanderismo is many, many things. And another thing I want to say is, those of us who are practitioners, because a lot of people I've noticed in my community, nobody wants to say that they're a curandera, because even if they're practicing the medicine, because we've had these teachers who are great and we were like, we're not them, we can't use that word. But one of my friends, colleagues, she's in the book, Sandra Pacheco, she differentiates it into like, there's small c curandera, curandero, curanderex. That's those of us who are using the medicina for ourselves, for our families, right? We're engaging with it. We're continuing traditions that have been preserved and passed on for hundreds of years, right? So we are practicing the medicine. And then like the big C curanderas are the ones who really make it their whole life. They're known in the community. And I really do believe it's something that the community acknowledges. And I hopefully that came across in the book. Like, this isn't a path that you study, you go to a couple workshops, and then you're like, I'm a curandera. Like, it's really, I believe we do work, we study, we serve our community, and then the community gives us that.
Absolutely. And what are your thoughts about, on that note, because of social media, I feel that social media just gives us so much access, and which is great and is needed, especially for marginalized communities. We finally have access to a whole, basically to a world of information and people and resources. But what I'm also seeing is this abundance, right, of this term, a curandera, curandero, curanderex, on social media. And and I feel that, in terms of, because they can, right, you can put that on your handle, you can claim that, you take a class and you can, there's no certification or anything like that, right? You can do that. However, I'm curious about, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, on one hand, of course, the access to information and reclamation, right, of our history and our lineage, which is critical and important. And then also, on the other hand, the I guess the caution that folks should have when it comes to those that are claiming this. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually have many conversations about this with, my colleagues, my peers, my friends. And actually I was just in a trip to Ojai in Los Angeles and was meeting with some people there. And we were talking about starting a council of curanderas, but you had to be 52 or older to just like have these conversations and also be available for the younger generations as like mentors and guides if that's wanted. But it's the landscape has changed so dramatically just in my lifetime. Like when I was in my 20s and interested, like I didn't know who to go to or who to ask. Like, and again, this was before the internet. So like I always say, in those days you had to like know people. You had to like find a flyer in a coffee shop. You had to like actually have real-time connection to study or to learn. And then now there's a blossoming of interest in practitioners, and I think that's great because a lot of them, this information has been carefully guarded, kept private, and also persecuted and discriminated against, right? And which continues to this day. So I'm concerned, and you're a mental health worker. Like I am concerned about people. Well, let me say one thing first. We can do this work with ourselves from the beginning, right? So I say, start with yourself, work with yourself. Like I used to tell my students, like do like at least 13 limpias on yourself. And then I would probably raise it to 52, like before you do it on someone else. Like take your time, get to know the medicina, apprentice with other people. Because once we start working with other people, like because we don't have the same training and certification as like a therapist, but at the same time, we're holding really deep space for people who may be re-experiencing trauma. I mean, all kinds of things can happen, and I have seen that happen. So I am concerned about people's safety, emotionally, physically, mentally, if we're working with energies and practices that we have not had I guess just the training and experience to hold that space. So that's one thing I guess that would be the main thing I'm concerned about. Also just the way that ego gets involved or capitalism. I mean, like I'm actually at the point, like I just work with, like I work as an herbalist and people can pay me as an herbalist because that's a skill, but I'm keeping my limpias just to like friends and family. And I don't, like if they want to exchange something, that's fine. Like trying to put a price tag on it always to me felt complicated. The healer needs to be compensated and we do really hard work, but so there's just all levels of complexity. So I think, that to balance that kind of eagerness and enthusiasm and claiming it, and that's all really good. But, I just know through my own, again, as a teacher, like people who I see in the world are like curanderas, and then they're asking me questions. I was like, you don't know this, and yet you're putting yourself out into the world in this way. So I've had many alarm bells go off, but it's interesting too. That's why it's like, we'll have this council of elder, and 52 in our tradition it's like when you've officially an elder, and just so we can have these conversations. And so I feel like it can hold both, like the excitement about the reclaiming and the growing, and also just like, okay, and the other thing is just allowing ourselves to take our time to really develop into a healer. Like from the time I first learned about a limpia, it was about 13 years later till I actually gave one. And I remember asking my maestra, Stella Romano, I was like, when will I be ready to give a limpia? And like all those years I was supporting her. and Doña Enriqueta like being like really like the one who cooked and cleaned and swept and maybe was in the rooms with them while they're giving their limpias, right? Because that's part of the learning. And Estela said, well, when people start to ask you, and you know, and I was like, oh, and then eventually people asked me, but it took a long time. So I feel like I was coming of age when there was still like the slow lane, and now things are going quicker, and we want to heal, we want our communities to heal, and there's so much susto, right? There's so much trauma, and the thing I'm concerned about is there's continuous new ones. Like I'm still healing my lifetime and my ancestors, but then there's mass shootings and climate crisis and police brutality and all these things that are like in our sphere. So I don't know what the answer is, like how to kind of harness the energy of everyone who's very excited to practice, but then also have some sort of, just counsel again, of those of us who have been in the path for decades, that we can just be of support and guidance.
Yeah, and you know, when you mentioned earlier that the term curanderismo is actually a newer, well, quote unquote, newer term, right? And in most people back in the day, I mean, I was talking to my mom, who's older and grew up in a very small pueblo in Mexico, and I was asking her about curanderismo. Did you know a curandera? And she's like, no, like we didn't call it that. Like when I was growing up, it was just, la señora que te cura, or la señora o la bruja del pueblo. So, and there were older folks, right, that have been maybe just they picked up this from their grandma or parent, and then when they came of age. So I think what you mentioned is that it takes time, right? For this energy, this healing, or even as a healer, for your gifts to marinate, right? As you're doing your own work. And so I love that you're bringing attention to the fact that we can start with ourselves, and we can incorporate all of this in our own life. But when it comes to sharing it with others, to just pace ourselves, right? And to allow this medicine to take form and to guide really our gifts and how we share this with others. And it took 13 years for you. That's shocking. Shocking, but not. But I'm glad that you're sharing that, because I think folks need to know, not just as a healer, but as a consumer, right? To always know who you're going to, and to, I guess, ask questions, right? It's valid to ask where you learn this, and who are your teachers. And I think all these questions are important to prevent harm, intentional or sometimes unintentional, right? People that mean very well, but they just don't have the experience. They end up causing harm or re-traumatizing.
Yeah, and it's also about taking care of ourselves too. I mean, and I look back and I know I made a lot of quote mistakes, but I'll just say they were lessons about how really about energies I absorbed from working with people, or much, or doing like events where it was like we just had like a line of people all day, and it's limpia after limpia after limpia.
Yes.
So
I think that's important too, right? How the impact that it takes on you as a healer, the energetic and physical impact over time, right? It can take a toll.
Definitely, yeah. And I've seen many members of our community, get sick, myself included. And so, I don't know if it's a higher rate than other people, but it's just like, I'm curious, like kind of going to things like spiritual hygiene or whatever, like we're interfacing with very strong aires, very strong, what we may say trauma or buried emotion.
I mean, it's because it's at the end, like we're energy, right? And I mean, I know, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, but just in my work as a therapist, sometimes I start feeling anxious before a particular client, or I get really sleepy, or before I even see them, and then I check in with them, and and then it makes sense. They're going through that, and and sometimes it comes out of nowhere. Like I was fine, I had my coffee, I was fine, and then I start feeling really tired. I'm like, okay, so I'm picking up their, what they're going through, and this happens. This is something that is science based. Like this is not just woo woo stuff, right? Like this happens, and for the folks that are more intuitive or more sensitive, it's even more intense. I can imagine. So I can, so as a curandera, doing this deep energy, spiritual work, connecting in such a deep way with folks, it must be, you must have to have some kind of system in place to protect yourself, protect your energy.
Yeah, what I think, again, going back to the traditional medicine practices in Mexico, I think a very important system in place is the temazcal, which is the place to sweat, which are different than the ones that are called sweat lodges in the like Plains Indian, Lakota, Dakota tradition. In Mexico, they're often made of adobe. So they're like little clay huts that you go in and you pray and you sweat and you cleanse. I think actually having that available to like clean ourselves off after we see our clients is really important. And I don't have one. I'm actually trying to get one. But again, like these practices, like how do we tend to ourselves after working with clients? So I think, if you have a temazcal to get in, that's a great way to like let it go. I've been there was this one healing clinic that I was a part of, a free healing clinic for women. And I was actually working as an herbalist that day, but there was curanderas like doing limpias all day, but back to back to back to back clients. And I remember like the next day I woke up and I just had to like sob. Like I had received like in my heard the stories. I felt with my heart. I'm very into whatever. I'm empathetic to the point of like I actually feel other people's feelings, which is a blessing and a challenge.
Absolutely. I can relate to that.
Yeah, I just like wept. I wept and wept.
Yeah.
I was like, I experienced and felt so much sorrow, heartbreak, frustration. And we were working with women who were, whatever, undocumented or formerly incarcerated or living in shelters for domestic abuse. Lots of hard stories. So
very complex. Yeah.
I think it's really important to have, practices in place as we take the steps to, to the work, and kind of going back to like what I feel like people can do as they learn, it's working with ourselves, but it's also like working with a small circle of people around you. Like I always say pets, like my cat's right here, you can't see her, but work with your animals. Like they get susto, they need tending, and they're like pretty safe beings to work with. Or maybe you have a child and working with them. Like I feel like that's the realm of kind of home and family is the realm. Again, that's like the family curandera. Like
absolutely.
That's a safe place because you're already kind of in their energies and know them pretty well.
Yeah, I think that's how traditionally. I think that's how it makes sense because you knew somebody that knew somebody, right? But initially it was through friends and family, and then eventually word of mouth. There was none of course, what we have today, and the widespread of information of who does what. But I want to go back to something that I haven't really talked about on the podcast, but I think it comes up a lot. Again, going back to my mom's generation and their perception of when they think of a healer or a curandera, they think of somebody that does brujeria, and so they see so from I'm talking just my mom, because that's who I have as a contact in that regard. But she talks about brujeria as one thing, and then there's those that que te curan, right, with herbs and or massage or body work. So she differentiates brujeria as very specific, but I've noticed, maybe it's because of social media, there's almost like a blend of both, and so I'm curious, how, from your perspective, how does curanderismo how does it relate to brujeria? Do you see it as a branch of that, of curanderismo, or is it like just a separate thing altogether?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is very, very complex. And I would say it really depends on the individual and the community they're part of, probably where they're living. So when I'll just share some stories. Like when I was doing my book, so I highlight 13 different curanderas who are either my mentors or my peers or my students, like people who I really love. And I think out of the book, 3 of them, no, 4 were older than me. So, it was just, so it's multi-generational. Like the oldest person in the book, Abuela Ellie, is turning 80 this year. And then the youngest is probably in their early 40s now. So when I interviewed a couple of the people who were older than me, like they really lived through times where even having an interest in traditional medicine or having like psychic abilities or healing abilities was viewed with a lot of suspicion. And the term bruja was really pejorative. Like, so they have one real perspective of brujeria and that word as like, no, I'm not that. And then at the same time, there's a lot of the younger generation people who are really reclaiming that word. Soy bruja, una bruja, or, that's my practice. And I think, and I'm sure there's a lot of overlaps between what people who identify with that practice do and then, what I do. And at the same time, historically, because of colonization by Catholic, monks and everybody from Spain, like when they came to Mexico and saw indigenous practices, including healing, that was labeled as work of the devil, right? As satanical. So there's this long history of really misinterpretation of spiritual traditions and healing practices and religious practices that were seen through the lens of of already what was happening. And we could also go back farther, what happened in Europe and the campaign against traditional healers, right, there, where
the Crusades,
women were labeled as witches, millions were persecuted and burned. So it's really like the history of that word, bruja or witch or whatever language we're going to say it in, it has like deep, complex roots and a lot of horrific historical events and, murder, right? Mass murder. So that same consciousness came to, Mexico. And so that, and I know it's still very alive today. Like I just actually met a new friend and she was talking about when she first started, she was excited. She was ready to start offering limpias to her community. And there was some very conservative Mexicanos who just were like, no, that's brujeria. No, I'm, and actually kind of targeted her. I was like, oh my God, that's still happening. Like it's very complicated. Like what I like to do is I try to be expansive in how people identify. Like if someone is, they choose that word bruja and they feel good about it and that's the work they do, then, then I allow that. And I also can allow, or I also totally hear my elders who feel uncomfortable with that term. And for me, both can be true. And at the same time, just add another level of complexity. I know in so many cultures, including, our ancestral cultures, there are people who do use medicine in a way that's not completely aligned with someone's highest good, right? Like where it's more manipulative or whatever. So that exists too. And so I just feel like it all exists. It's all very complicated. I have never been trained by anyone who said, I'm a bruja, and this is what this is our practices. Like all my mentors identified as curanderas, so that's my comfortable title or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very, I think it's when we just to be in conversation about it comes out like every time, because there's always, and I think people, again, if you grew up, maybe your mom or certain generations or places where there's actually a lot of fear in people about like, if you do the huevo and do the limpia, that's like
I think there is a lot of fear of what they can do to you, in terms of when they say they sit on brujeria is a term that tends to reflect something, they did something negative to you, like almost like witchcraft, right? It's like that's they're so to hurt you, right? It's like so it's very magical for me, when in brujeria, when I think of that term, I associate it with just magic, right? And so I want to touch real quick. I know we're running out of time, but I want to touch real quick on something that you are you talk a lot about, and and I heard you share on another podcast that a book might be coming on this topic, ancestral healing and ancestral connection. What does that mean to you? And how is that part of, or how do you incorporate that as part of the work that you do and your medicine?
Definitely. Yeah. That's really something that's I've been curious about, and I guess passionate about for many years of my life. So, and I think my understanding of it, or my framework of it, changes too. Like when I think I was younger, it's like, I want to heal on my ancestors. And then now I'm like, wow, that was, as an older person, like, wow, that was like a really big assignment. Like, let's work on, like, again, this body, this heart, this vessel that I'm in is my ancestral inheritance. So working on myself, being able to maybe change patterns of whether it's addiction or trauma that were passed down intergenerationally, like that's part of it. I feel like another part of it is just connecting with the story, with the history, and really knowing who we come from and what happened to our parents, our grandparents, our great grandparents that brought us to this moment. And then for me, the part that that really I like to focus on are connecting with or reconnecting, depending on who we are, with the practices, with the medicinas, with the herbs, with the food, with the rituals that sustained our people for many, many, many generations. And then because of many things, immigration, colonization, war, there's been a disconnect. So for me, it's like returning to the practices of, making a herbal tea or cooking these certain meals or gathering the way my ancestors gathered. And I feel like we all can do that. And I feel like that helps then. I feel like the medicine of our ancestors is also like helps us, can be very effective when working with our ancestral and intergenerational trauma, of which we all have. And I know because I listened to that conversation, I was excited to learn about that book. Was it Jessica who wrote the
Which one?
It was a book on healing ancestral trauma for BIPOC people. Anyways, I don't have to. It was an interview I heard.
Natalie Gutierrez.
Oh, okay, Natalie.
Yeah. She wrote. Yeah, she talks a lot about that. Yeah.
So that was really exciting. I'm going to get that book. So yeah. So for me, there's many, many levels to it. There's the connection, literally, to the humans. There's the connection, like what were the names of my grandparents, great grandparents, to their story, to their history, to their practices. And one thing, and I've learned this from different therapists. Like I feel like your field is really doing some incredible stuff with trauma, but that, you know, we inherit the trauma of our ancestors, but we also inherit their gifts and their resilience. So for me, it's also, I feel like for me, the gifts are connected to the practices, to the herbs. And so we can use that as we navigate all the complex layers of healing.
No, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that a lot of folks associate when we talk about ancestral connection or connecting with our ancestors. I think a lot of people think of like mediumship or doing more of that. And what you described is what resonates with me. And it's just getting to know your lineage, right? And where you come from and their struggles, the cycles, the patterns, right? And then reflecting on how it's being manifested in my own lived experience. But I think there is an important component of ancestral healing that comes through the connection with your ancestors, right? And tapping into that spirit world. How, is that something that is part of your ancestral practice now, in terms of the spirit world, or is it something that you're still exploring at this point?
So yeah, I definitely, I mean, you can't see, but I have many ancestral altars, and they keep getting bigger because more people keep becoming ancestors. But I have, regular, whatever, prayer, communication, connection with different ones of them. And what I'm noticing is different ancestors kind of have different blessings or areas of focus in my life that they help me out with. So, and I think it's subtle work, because we could sit there and like pray. Like, for example, yesterday was the 8th year anniversary of my father's death. And my dad, since he died, has been he really actually helps with my career. Like, I'm pretty sure he's the reason I even got a book contract, because
Oh, that's
someone
beautiful.
even approached me about the book. Like, that, I don't know, I wasn't expecting that. Like, but he's good at like opening doors or bringing
I
people.
love that.
I also work with people who aren't my blood lineage, but were my good friends or, colleagues or whatever, who are also on the ancestor altar, who may help me. And, so I don't want to also just be one way, like they're helping me, but I feel like I'm also remembering them, like, as like, oh, like a friend of mine became an ancestor last November, and she loved music and dancing and drumming. And so there's some times when I just feel like I'll play my music and I'm dancing. I'm like, oh, this is Symbwala, like telling me to like dance it out. Like, so it's also keeping their legacy alive and their
I
energy
love that.
of the way that they touched our lives and our hearts. And so in that way they're living on. And I mean, the other layer, which I think is with our blood ancestors, our family, is sometimes they also have unfinished business. And so that's where I feel like healing can happen as we kind of tune into what they maybe are trying to ask our help with. So there's many levels to it.
So beautiful. Thank you for sharing your journey with that. And tell us a little bit about, for folks that would love to get familiar with you, your work, and get your book. How can folks find you? Where can we get your book? And how can people say or connect with you or stay in touch with you?
Cool. Yeah. So my book, the full title, Curanderismo Toolkit: Reclaiming Ancestral Latinx Plant Medicine and Rituals for Healing. I always recommend that people go to your local independent bookstore and ask them to carry it, because then you support your local economy. I know online there's I think it's bookshop.org, that is kind of like an umbrella organization of independent sellers, as kind of an alternative to Amazon. it is on Amazon. I know that's really accessible for people, but I always say try everything else first. My publisher, Heyday Books, also you can also order directly from the publisher. And I'm excited to have found the books in many libraries. So even just ask your library to carry it, because one of my guiding principles is that this information, these teachings should be available and accessible to everybody, regardless of resources. So libraries are good for that. So yeah, I do teach. So what I didn't say is before this was a book, this was a class. So I began, it was first called the Curanderismo Toolkit class in 2011, evolved to be Curanderex, just to include all gender expansiveness in the community and in the path. So I teach that class, the Curanderismo Toolkit class. I'm actually teaching this evening as a spring and fall session through Ancestral Arts Apothecary, which the long story, but I had founded the school called Ancestral Apothecary, which I stewarded for many years, and then passed it on to another person who renamed it Ancestral Arts Apothecary. So I still teach there. My own website is called Ancestral Apothecary, and so if people want to work with me as an herbalist or the other work I do, they can reach me there or sign up for my newsletter. On Instagram, I'm Curanderismo Toolkit, although I am now a private account because of all the creepy spamming that's happening to pretty much everybody I know in our fields.
Yeah.
So I say, if you want to become my friend, maybe just like send me a message. So I know, I mean, I'm really trying to figure out who's real and who's like a fake, and but I mean, there's actually very aggressive and violent things happening.
Oh yeah.
And so maybe there'll be another platform that will evolve, but I don't know. But yeah, those are some ways people can keep in touch with me. And I do teach, I'm teaching a couple places in New Mexico, and I'll be doing a couple of book events in the Detroit area in June. So wherever if I get an invitation, I'm always open to collaborating or visiting different communities. And also what's nice about Zoom is I've also been able to like Zoom and teach in a community in the East Coast. So it's less intensive than actually travel.
Right. Well, thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom, your story with us. And you are welcome next time in your next book. I would love to have you back.
Yeah, thank you, Rosa, for the conversation and for all the work you're doing. I think it's really important.
Oh, thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope that you found it healing and nourishing to your mind and soul. If there's a friend that you think would benefit from listening to this information, please share it. Share about our podcast. If you feel called to, please leave us a review, as this really, really helps boost our presence here in Apple Podcasts, and it makes it easier for others to find us. To stay up to date on new episode releases and special events and projects that I'm working on, you can follow us on Instagram at Inner Healing Paths Podcast. And you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to my website, which is rosachettilcsw.com. And I will include this information and links in the show notes. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to sharing with you again next time.